Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Each year on the 12th of June, the UN observes World Day Against Child Labor. This day is a means to reflect upon how far the world has come to eradicate this practice that exploits children. Unfortunately, it seems like we have a long way to go. Official UN estimates show that more than 150 million children are involved in child labor globally. But these are just figures that have been reported. There are many children who still remain unaccounted for. On tonight's show, we discuss whether the world is in fact doing all it can to fight child labor and what more needs to be done. Let's take a look at a brief report before we begin.
Children shouldn't work in the fields or factories, but on their dreams. But the truth is, over 200 million children find themselves stuck in child labor around the world. Every economic sector puts children to work, especially agriculture, which employs 71% of the child labor force. It is often said children are the future of the world, but millions are still forced into work which holds back their mental and physical growth. They also lose their fundamental right to education. The International Labour Organization says 73 million children are forced to work in dangerous conditions. Almost half of all child laborers work in Africa, while in Asia, poverty pushes 62 million children to work. 17 million children find themselves toiling in the Americas, Arab states, Europe and Central Asia. Poverty is among the main factors pushing children to sell their labor. They have to make a choice between subsistence and education. Alleviating poverty is the biggest goal in ending child labor. Other things can be done, such as improving awareness and sensitizing society to the needs of the most vulnerable people working today.
To discuss this topic today, we welcome our panel to the show. Joining us today is Ms. Juliane Kippenberg, who's an Associate Director at Children's Rights Division at the Human Rights Watch. She's joining us from Berlin. Thank you so much, Ms. Kippenberg, for joining us. Now tell us, in a summary, from when this fight against eradicating child labor began, how far have we come along?
Thank you. Yes, we have come some way. I mean, it's quite interesting when you look at the figures. In 2000, there were about 245 million children working globally in child labor. And yet today, the number has dropped by almost 100 million. So there has clearly been significant progress. We think that some of the progress is probably due to the rollout of education, particularly primary education, in many countries around the world. Nevertheless, on the other hand, we have 152 million children still working today in agriculture, in domestic labor, in mining, and in many other sectors.
Right.
And that is clearly way too much.
Right. But here, Ms. Kippenberg, I'd also like to talk about the unaccounted numbers. We do know that the number of displaced persons is very, very high due to all the conflict. And we do know that because of that, children out of school is a very high number. Now, it could be that we just don't have all the figures here yet to determine whether the number of people involved in child labor has decreased or not. Could that be the case?
We don't actually do statistical research on this ourselves, so we are relying on the we're relying on the International Labour Organization statistics here. We believe that they're doing a very good effort to really document this. They come out with very comprehensive reports every 4 years. So, we've seen that there's definitely some work that has gone into this. But the figure that we're using today is indeed from 2016. So some time has come past, and we don't know whether the numbers have actually gone up or down. The second point you're mentioning, I think, is important. There are millions of adolescents out of school. And of course, it could be that, some of these children are not covered, as could be some children who are actually in school. So they are enrolled, but they still work at the same time. It is definitely a very difficult issue to document.
Right. And in that case, I think it's very important, it's very imperative that we define what child labor is exactly, because the International Labour Organization also stated that not all work done by children should be classified as child labor. So here, what is the definition we're working with?
The definition that the International Labour Organization uses, but also that we are relying upon because it's sort of framed in international law, is that child labor is the kind of work that deprives a child of its education and that harms a child's moral, physical, mental development. So that is child labor. Whereas, the work of children helping their family in a household a couple of hours a week, and other types of work, for example, helping in a family business or earning a little bit of pocket money on the side, is fine as long as this work doesn't endanger the child and it doesn't actually endanger their schooling.
Right. And on that point, I'd also like to introduce another guest who's joining us, Professor Andrew Sesuraj, who's a professional social worker, human rights activist. He has also worked with UNICEF as a consultant for child protection. He's joining us from Chennai, India. Thank you so much, Professor Andrew, for joining us. Now, while we're talking about child labor, we know that the contexts for it vary across regions significantly. The cases are very different from what's happening in developed nations to what is happening in developing nations and in Asian nations. Given the context of this region, what can you tell us about the state of child labor today?
The children, when they are engaged in family-based entrepreneurship, supporting their families and earning a little income, without disturbing their ongoing education. Okay, that is perfectly fine. But that's we see in all developed countries where children are engaged in part-time work, learning to do some trade. It's perfectly fine. But that's not the case in developing countries. Whereas, for example, in sub-Saharan countries, in Asian countries, that is not the case. Because in these countries, the money or the economy comes out from the labor of the children, placed to be the breadwinning, the livelihood in many families. So that's where we have to see the difference.
Right.
And in Asian context, how we see as child rights activists and human rights activists, we don't see those children who are working alone in the formal sector or in the hazardous sector as children, child laborers. We see any child who is out of a formal school as a child laborer. He may not be working, she may not be working at the present context, but he is a very prospective child laborer. He can become a child laborer at any point of time.
Then, Professor Andrew, here don't the numbers get inflated? Because we do know in parts of the world, the education system is not fully functional. It's not up to the mark. And that would, of course, inflate the number of kids that are labeled as child laborers, given your definition.
You are well said, exactly. But that's how we need to see. For example, a child who is not in a school, where he will land. He will not be at home. Okay, he will not be just playing at home. Okay, he will be doing something or the other, and that's what we see as labor. Okay, so unless we ensure that a child is in school until the UNCRC mentioned age, 18 years. Okay, any child who is not in a school is a prospective child labor. Until we look at in this perspective, we will not be able to bring back every children into the school. And that's how we see it in India.
Right. Professor Andrew, I'd like to talk a little about the common arguments we hear about people, that children who come from impoverished backgrounds, they are stuck in a dilemma, whether to go to school or whether to earn enough so they can survive. In this case, how do we create a nuanced argument or a nuanced discussion regarding child labor?
Yes. For example, any government for that matter, okay, they are duty bound. Okay, in the world except US, all the other countries have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Okay, which means it is mandated that no child should be exploited for economic exploitation as child labor. So which means the governments have the responsibility to ensure that no children are in labor and every child is in school. Okay, as per the UN Convention on the rights of the child. For that matter, any country in the UN member state has ratified this UN convention, so they are
so the onus lies with the government to ensure that those children have that means to survive. On that point, hold on to that, Professor. Ms. Kippenberg, while we're talking about that the onus lies with the government, not all governments have the means to provide for all the people in their population. The ideal case would be that they do so. In this, how does the international global community need to collaborate or work together to ensure that every child is in school?
Yeah, this is indeed a very important goal. And of course, all countries have to come together to really realize that goal. And poorer nations can not necessarily do this by themselves. So an important example for this is access to education. That is probably the single most important measure that is needed to ensure that children do not work but can go to school. And of course, with various donors coming together around this goal of access to education, we have seen that improved access to school and the lowering or even abolition of school fees has really helped get children into school. But there are other measures that have to be taken by governments as well, by the governments in all countries. As Professor said, there are obviously international laws and obligations for all governments, even governments that are poorer. But donor governments can play a key role in supporting their efforts. In particular, social protection schemes such as stipends or cash transfer programs for poor families to enable them not to send their children to work, but rather to send them to school. We have seen, for example, in Brazil or in some African countries such as Kenya, that these social protection programs can work very well. So those are some of the measures. Other measures are probably more to do with labor conditions and also company responsibilities. Governments need to ensure, of course, that adult laborers have fair working conditions, so they don't need to have their children with them. And I want to mention lastly the real importance of companies. There are many products that are traded globally. That could be coffee, that can be tobacco, gold, bricks, all sorts of products are traded globally, yet at the bottom of these supply chains are quite often child laborers. There's a study that came out last year in the US that showed this for 76 countries. And so it's important that companies all over the world, not just in the producing countries, have an obligation to ensure that in their supply chains is no child labor.
Right. And Ms. Kippenberg, that's a very, very key point you make there, and something we're going to talk about in greater depth in the show further on. But before that, I want to ask my last question to Professor Andrew. While we're talking about the global economic system here, supply chains, let's discuss how that has enabled child labor so far and has allowed it to flourish, especially in developing countries. Now, it's not just about aid flowing in from developed countries. It's also about fair practices, which create space and which pressurize developing nations to not allow child labor. How do you think they have failed to do so far?
To a great extent, the international community, the international business has supported in eradication of child labor. Because I myself know the business establishments which have sent their representatives here to check whether the processes of the production has children being employed or fair trade practices, fair labor practices are being engaged. So when I say that
just there, Professor, when these companies send representatives to check what is happening here, and if they did find children involved in labor, what did they do? Did they report that back when they went back home? Or did they allow it?
Back because it happened in both ways. For example, here, they reported it to the authorities. As well, they have reported it to the business establishment from where they have been engaged. So both had happened, and that's how it was. We were able to reduce considerably the number of children who are in the farmer sector. So that is where, for example, for this year, the theme was children should not work in fields but on dreams, because agriculture plays a major role. So that is what the government of India has also given as a condition while ratifying the UNCRC in 1992.
Right.
Okay, saying that the number of children in agriculture is very high, so India will take progressive steps.
At that point, thank you so much, Professor Andrew, for joining us and talking to us. Ms. Kippenberg, continuing with you, and let's talk more about the industries which have allowed for children to be a part of their labor force for a very long time. Now, give us a sense of how vast this problem is and in how many industries does this issue exist?
The issue and the problem is vast. There is about 152 million children working globally in child labor and being exploited, and about half of these children work in hazardous work, so particularly dangerous type of work. It's also vast when you look at the world. I mean, in Africa, it's about 72 million, in Asia and the Pacific, about 62, in Latin America, also about 10. So it's very significant numbers. When we look at the sectors, many sectors are involved. As we've mentioned before, agriculture is the biggest sector. Human Rights Watch has documented the exploitation of children working in agriculture. For example, Palestinian children working in vegetable agriculture in Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. Or we have also documented in many countries by now the highly hazardous use of child labor in tobacco farming. For example, in Indonesia, in Zimbabwe, and even in the United States, where there's actually a loophole in US law allowing children to do dangerous work in agriculture. So that is a huge problem. But we have also documented many other types of child labor. For example, we have documented how children work with toxic mercury when they process gold in artisanal gold mines in the Philippines and in several African countries, for example, Ghana.
Right.
So there's really a whole range of sectors where child labor is used.
Right. And I just want to focus a little more on the regions in which we see a very high number of child laborers. And you mentioned as well Africa, in which almost 72 million children are found to be involved in child labor. Why exactly do you think that is the case? And it seems like the world knows about it. It's a dirty secret, but everybody knows about it. Why do you think enough effort hasn't been made to bring this number down?
So I think it's a combination of issues. Of course, poverty plays a huge role. Poverty at the household level simply means that families that are cash-strapped send their children to work where they can earn a bit of a living, contribute to the family income. But then really there is also a massive problem with governments not addressing this significantly and not putting enough priority on it either. For example, in Ghana, where I have documented how children worked in artisanal gold mining, the government, the labor ministry had very, very little funding to actually address these issues and was really, busy mostly with other concerns. So governments, not just in Ghana, but in many countries in Africa, but equally in Asia, don't necessarily do enough to really prioritize this problem, ensure access to primary education, but also to secondary education.
Right,
because it's not good enough to end at grade 6.
Right, but Ms. Kippenberg, is it just those governments that exist in Africa or in Asia? Because I have some figures here about the cocoa industry in which they have had set targets in which they have missed continuously. 2005, 2008, 2010, they missed these targets and able to eradicate the child labor involved in producing this for very, very large chocolate companies. And they're probably going to miss the next target, which is in 2020. These are international companies working in developed nations, some of the biggest names there. So who do we hold responsible in this? Because it seems like the developed nations aren't really pulling their weight.
So definitely, of course, the governments where the children are working do have a responsibility. They have ratified international conventions, and almost all countries actually have quite good labor laws on child labor as well. So they have a responsibility, but you're right to point to the company responsibility as well. Large or small companies can't just be let off the hook. Particularly global international companies have a responsibility to ensure that they track their own supply chain. We have looked at the issue of gold trade and have found that oftentimes, for example, jewelers don't necessarily even know where their gold is coming from. So then they also cannot check if there's child labor at the bottom of their supply chains. So these companies and the gold refiners that are sort of in the middle of that supply chain have a responsibility to ensure that they conduct what's called proper due diligence, that they really check what risks for abusers, including child labor, are there, and that they address them properly. And of course, if they find that they really have sourced from places, for example, where children work and are exploited, well, they have to remedy that situation.
Right. And firms, organizations such as yours that are working for human rights, how are you guys aiding in the process of making these supply chains more transparent, or allowing people who are involved in these supply chains to have a voice and come forward and claim their rights?
So yes, we are a research and advocacy organization. So what we do primarily is we go to these places that are often quite far away and people don't necessarily know what the conditions are like. And we really give a voice to those children. So, we have interviewed, for example, 16-year-old migrant workers in the United States who were suffering from terrible health effects from working in tobacco fields, but who usually don't have a voice. We've spoken to very young children working in gold mines in Ghana and Mali, for example, or equally in the Philippines, where they're actually diving underwater for gold. So we give them a voice, and then we go to governments and companies and advocate for their rights. So we push these governments to really ensure that the laws are in place, are enforced, and as we mentioned, laws in and of themselves are not enough. Just prohibiting child labor won't really do the job. What really has to happen is that the families that are very poor are in a position where they can actually send a child to school and not to work, where they get some support. And getting to school isn't a huge obstacle, for example, by having huge fees. And then lastly, companies have a responsibility as well.
Right. And on that note, thank you so much, Ms. Juliane Kippenberg, for joining us and taking the time out to talk to us. Now we're joined by Mr. Benjamin Smith, who is a child labor specialist working with the International Labour Organization. He's joining us from Geneva. Thank you so much, Mr. Smith, for joining us. Now, we have been talking about international laws and conventions that are in place and that have been ratified by many countries that are supposed to protect children's rights. But have there been examples and have there been cases in which these countries who were not following these obligations, they were punished for them, punitive measures were taken against them and forced them to change their ways?
Well, as you say, the international conventions, the treaties around child labor are widely ratified. In fact, the ILO Convention on Worst Forms of Child Labor is very close to universal ratification. So the countries that don't have laws in place against child labor are really the very slim minority. But obviously, adopting the conventions and passing laws isn't enough in and of itself. They need to be implemented. Right. And otherwise, they're not worth more than the paper they're written on. So there have been instances where the ILO, in its supervisory mechanism, once countries ratify our conventions, they're followed up on, and countries are required to report on the implementation. When that implementation is not adequate, then our supervisory mechanism, as we call it, a committee of experts, will inform the government of that. And also, by the way, because we're a tripartite organization, workers' organizations and employers' organizations also have a say. So to give you a quick example of how this machinery has worked, in Uzbekistan some years ago, there was a very serious and widespread problem of children working in the cotton harvest. And there was international outrage about this because it was also state-sponsored. So with careful negotiations and discussions and in a process of social dialogue, as we call it, with the Uzbek government, with workers and employers organizations, the Uzbekistan ratified the child labor conventions. As a next step, ILO came in with a monitoring program so that every harvest season in cotton, we could measure and detect any child labor that was occurring. So year on year, there was progress until today. We can say that child labor is virtually eliminated from cotton harvesting. Still some work to do for sure, particularly on forced labor. But just to give you an idea of how these conventions can be put into practice.
Right. But with that, we're still seeing that while they are, it's like you're saying, virtually eliminated from cotton harvesting, the largest sector in which child laborers are employed is still agriculture. And we stated a figure of 150 million children being employed in child labor. So how far have there's been an elimination of child laborers from the agricultural sector?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And indeed, of the 152 million child laborers today, 108 million are in agriculture. So that's 71% are involved in child labor in agriculture. There has been progress for sure. From 2000 until 2016, we have detected a decline of 38% in child labor. Of course, that's not enough. Any child in child labor is one too many. And we need to accelerate the progress if we're going to meet the Sustainable Development Goal of ending all child labor by 2025. So agriculture, particularly in rural-based societies where there are particularly family farms, most child labor occurs within that family context, lifting those households out of poverty so they no longer have to depend on child labor is the challenge.
Right. And Mr. Smith, hold on to that thought. I also want to introduce Mr. Arshad Mahmood, who has joined us. He's a child rights activist and member of child rights movement in Pakistan. He's joining us from Islamabad. Thank you so much, Mr. Mahmood, for joining us. Now, as we were talking about the percentage of children involved in agricultural industry as child laborers, we were talking to Mr. Smith about it, and the goal is to eliminate and eradicate those children. But based in Pakistan, based in this region, do you think it's a plausible goal to expect the complete eradication of that by 2025?
Thank you very much for having me. And frankly speaking, like the laws about child labor in Pakistan that we have currently, initially we had the Employment of Children Act 1991, and now we have provincial laws. Like in Punjab, we have the Punjab Restriction of Child Labor Act 2016. Similarly, we have in KP and Sindh. I believe these laws are basically mostly focusing on formal, the Employment of Children Act in formal sector. And they are not focused on agriculture sector, whereby I agree that a large number of working children are in the agriculture sector in Pakistan. So first point is, if we talk from a legal perspective, so we still have to work on legislation around the eradication of child labor in agriculture sector. Besides that, there are other areas like, for example, child domestic labor, children working in the domestic servitude. That is another area where a large number of children are working in Pakistan, and that's not covered under any law. The Domestic Workers Act in Punjab, I think, covered it to some extent, but implementation is still, a distant dream. So if we talk about, banning child labor or those things, we still have to go a long way.
Right. So you don't think that it is realistic to expect 2025 to be the time when all of child labor is eradicated, especially from the agricultural industry?
It should be done. I believe that if we have agreed to the SDG target, we should work towards it. But what I meant to say is that no practical steps have been taken towards that. And for me, one clear strategy is, for example, the prevention strategy could be that enrolling children in schools, and we are still having 22 million children of school-going age out of school, and most of them are in the rural areas. So, we still have to work
a long way to go
to be able to eradicate child labor.
And thank you so much, Mr. Arshad Mahmood, for joining us and providing us perspective regarding this region. Now, Mr. Smith, just a last question to you before we go for a break. Now, we were talking about how there are corporations involved in child labor and international corporations, big, huge conglomerates. Now, given the economic aims and the business models that they operate on, let's take an example of the cocoa industry, in which we saw there were several targets that were missed for eradication of child labor, and 2020 is the next target. Given that, the amount of profits or the amounts of revenue for the industry are supposed to reach $160 billion by 2024. Now, we have an aim of revenue maximization here and the eradication of the supply chain that is behind producing this. With these two struggling aims, how can they be reconciled? And do you think the business model will win in this case?
Well, I think certainly companies, whether multinational companies or domestic companies for that matter, do have a responsibility to understand if there is child labor in their supply chain. So do the research investigation that's necessary. If there is child labor in the supply chain, there is also a responsibility to act in good faith, to engage supply chain partners, to engage with government, to organize efforts to withdraw.
Mr. Smith, sorry to interrupt here, but we know that these in the capitalist system, these firms are not working as philanthropists. They are working to extract as much as profit as possible, so they're not going to carry out the needed investigation. And they haven't so done in the past. They haven't met the previous goals. How can we expect them to do so in the future?
Well, I think that that recognition that business practices matter and how supply chains are organized matter is increasingly understood. And with regard to household poverty and enterprises in the supply chain that are not receiving enough income to be able to send their children to school, if it's a family-based enterprise, for example, that's certainly a concern. And looking at how profits are distributed along the value chain is an important question. Child labor is driven by and large by poverty and by informality. And so I think part of what companies need to do is look at how business practices can support formalization of those enterprises and economic viability, even at the far end of the supply chain where there's very little visibility, let's face it, and oftentimes a lack of understanding of where those commodities come from. So there's a big challenge, and it's for companies, but also and particularly governments that need to enforce the laws against child labor and provide alternatives.
Right. On another note of talking about child labor, I do want to talk a little about child trafficking. We know we're looking at child labor as being something that exists within borders. But a recent report by the UN that came out in 2018 stated that child trafficking, human trafficking, has gone up significantly, and 30% of those people involved are children. Now, just take us through how that links to child labor and what happens through that process, the exploitation, and what's going on in the background.
Yeah, absolutely. So of the 152 million children who are in child labor, we also need to add the about 4.3 million children who are in forced labor, so trafficking and situations similar to slavery. About 1 million of those are in commercial sexual exploitation, so child prostitution. 3 million are in forced labor exploitation, and about 300,000 are state-sponsored forced labor of children. So the statistics are staggering, to say the least. how that operates is often not what one would typically think about when you think of slavery, the images that conjures up of chains and cages. It's far from it. Oftentimes, it's the parents who are caught in debt bondage, for example, who, for example, may take out a loan, be unable to pay the loan, perhaps because the crops fail, and so they become indebted to the landowner or their employer, and their children, therefore, are also indebted. So this is a subtle, maybe, way of that modern slavery manifesting itself, but it certainly is widespread these days.
Right. And thank you much on that note, Benjamin Smith, for joining us and talking to us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to discuss this issue further. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we continue our discussion, we are now joined by Mr. Mohammad Benyameen, who is the project coordinator for International Labour Organization in Pakistan. He's joining us from Lahore. We're also joined by Ms. Shantha Sinha, who's the former chairperson of the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights, Government of India. She's joining us from Hyderabad, India. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. Mr. Mian, let me begin with you. Now, we've been talking about the circumstances under which children are forced to go out and work. We have talked about the international conventions which exist to protect them. But let's talk a little more about the vulnerabilities that are faced by children once they are out in the field or once they are employed in these organizations or exploitative practices. Take us through that.
Okay. First of all, as we have said, that why the children are working, certainly the basic issue is behind this is the poverty and also the lack of awareness, the proper opportunities. There are two types of situations. One is where the children are working with their parents, which is less harmful as compared to the children who are working in the workplaces and they are in the markets. So once they are away from their families, once they are away from their home, so they are open to any type of the vulnerabilities. So they are open to all type of vulnerabilities, which are even for their physical and for their mental. So that's why, as you said, that the conventions which are for the protection of the children who are working is talking about both for the mental and the physical growth of a child. When these are jeopardized, when these are compromised, so it constitutes the child labor. So these are the things where these are very severely affecting the children as it is taking away for the children, first of all, from his education. Secondly, all the childhood is gone, because when he is working with the adults, when he is working with the workplaces, so that then he is open to any type of vulnerability which is available at that place while working with the adults.
Right. Ms. Sinha, Mr. Mia talked about awareness, how that is the key factor in trying to eradicate this problem. Now, let's talk about the role of civil society and the government, both. How and what needs to be done from both ends to make sure that they're playing their role in eradicating this?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for calling me on this conversation we are having. Let me first tell you about what parents aspire for all over South Asia. You know, the poorest of parents want their children to be educated. There's enormous demand for education, and all of them see that without education, there is no break in the cycle of poverty. So we will have to respect the parents' demand for education in all our countries. Having said this, there's also this argument that children are poor and so they have to work. Let me tell you that children are working not as much because they are poor, but because there is a need for cheap labor. Employers find it convenient to employ children because you can force them to work for long hours. I think we will have to now go beyond the poverty argument and look at other factors other than poverty that make a child work. Most often it is because of lack of schools or because schools are not friendly enough to the first generation learners. Secondly, it is also because there is no social in support of children's right to education. Nobody is shocked in our countries that children are working. There is no outrage that children are working. I think NGO and the government will have to raise the debate to express shock and outrage that children, it is intolerable to find children out of school. They must not be at work and they must be in school.
Right.
The third thing is we must believe that it is possible.
Right.
To constantly think that it is not possible to abolish child labor, I think is defeating the very purpose of any dialogue that we can have. If you believe it is possible, it can be done.
Right. And Ms. Sinha, following from the point of education, that seemed to be a point that all of our panelists raised regarding child labor, that once you increase the demand for education, that will reduce the number of children employed in child labor. But let's take it from another angle. Now, with the school system in place, many children and their families invest a lot in the education process and higher education, and when they graduate or when they leave schools, they do not find jobs and reasonable employment. Many people opt for the route of vocational training here, and they think that that might provide them a livelihood. In this dilemma of a great number of unemployed graduates and those children who would rather just take the route into the professional field from an early age, how do we stir this conversation in the right direction?
No, first of all, we have all the time linked education to the issue of jobs and employment. Let us look at it differently. I think the purpose of education is education itself. It's not a means to entering up with a job market, but it is a means for self-respect. It is a means for self-esteem. It's a means for confidence. It is a means for equality. It's a means for justice. And I think if you look at it in these terms, definitely it is always better that you're literate and unemployed rather than you're an illiterate and an employed.
Right.
Any day it is, this argument constantly comes.
Right.
Imagine in a room, there are a whole lot of illiterate.
Right. And Ms. Sinha, we're short on time there, but I've registered your point there, and thank you so much for joining us and talking to us about this. Following from Mr. Mia, as Ms. Sinha rightly pointed out, that the value of education shouldn't always be linked to the monetary outcomes. But of course, we have to be cognizant about the fact that that is a privileged point of view as well, because many people are educating themselves to survive out in the field. So my same question I'll put to you. How do we balance between not finding employment and just going into vocational training and getting kids out of child labor?
I think we cannot isolate this issue, and we can't say that. I certainly respect that education is not only seen with respect to the employment, but certainly it is one of the major things which we are pursuing for this. And as you have mentioned about the technical vocational education, that is, I think, is the best way of linking the children who are after a certain age where it is permissible under the law that they can join the technical vocational education, so they can be a productive workers as well. And meanwhile, they can also continue their studies. Studies for the sake of studies certainly is putting the more unemployment. So I think the best way of linking it with the vocational education that can produce better results, especially when we are talking about with reference to the children who have already been employed in certain trades, or they have already put some year of their employment in that. So I think for them, the best way is either to go through, if possible, formal education is best, but if not, then the non-formal education linked with the technical education.
Right. And on that point, Mr. Mia, I'm going to introduce another guest who's joined us, Ms. Sara, who's the chairperson of Child Protection and Welfare Bureau, Punjab. She's joining us from Karachi. Thank you so much, Ms. Sara, for joining us. Now, we've been talking about taking children out of child labor and providing them education. But what needs to come before that? Surely, after being engaged in child labor, there is a huge amount of trauma to deal with. What needs to be done for the rehabilitation process?
Okay, so thank you for taking me on your show. And on World Day Against Child Labor, I would like to give a message firstly, that we need to collaborate, all the stakeholders need to collaborate to eradicate this menace, because these children deserve education for a prosperous future and for a better Pakistan. Now, talking about child labor, you were talking about rehabilitation. What I want to tell you, what Child Protection Welfare Bureau is doing right now all across Punjab. So we have a helpline, it's 1121. So every day we are reported about cases of torture and abuse on child labor, child domestic labor violence, and child labor also. So our team goes and rescues these children, and we give them an offer. So we give them an offer that if they want, they can stay with us in the bureau, because right now we have over 800 children living with us in our shelter homes, and the government is providing their living, their education and everything, their medical. They stay with us till the age of 18, and then we find them employment ourselves. So we give them an offer that if they want or their parents want, they can give the kids to us to stay in our bureau. This is what and then we also counsel the parents so that they don't put them again in this profession.
Right. And now that is definitely a very ongoing process in which you are playing an active role. You're contributing and taking those kids out of the employment they are bonded with. But let's talk about more long-term policies that can be implemented in order to pressurize governments, organizations not to take children into employment in the first place. What options do you think exist?
So right now what we can do is, there should be a law which should be passed. Actually, the law is there, but the implementation is not there. Maybe the government should do a survey of all the houses, and then check where there's, and take strict action against the families who've employed young children. That's one way of monitoring. And the second way is that giving incentives to these families by providing these people vocational training. That can be one option, because the government has lots of options of vocational trainings which are for free. So these kids they get stipend also. They pay stipend to these kids and they train them on the different skills like computer handling, like, mechanical training, stuff like that. Yeah. So I think these two options can be worked upon.
And Mr. Mia, on that same point, what do you think is urgent policy, not just in this region, but globally, that needs to be enforced in order to make sure that we have a quick meet of the 2025 target of eradicating child labor?
As I will again emphasize on the points that why the children are working, because they are supporting their family income. So if the parents are given, or the adults, members of the family are giving their decent work, the decent jobs, decent employment opportunities, then certainly they don't need to engage the children with them to support their income. So the only agenda I think which we forwarded is to have the decent work employment, decent opportunities for the parents and the adults of the families, so they can earn sufficiently and send their children to the schools, not to the work.
Right. And on that point, thank you so much, Mr. Mohammed Benyameen Mia, for joining us and talking to us. Thank you, Ms. Sara Ahmad. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.